It was a good airplane because it was advanced and ambitious, but not too advanced and too ambitious. President Carter, who had run against the B-1, had to make a decision as to whether we were going to go ahead with the B-1 or not.
This has been one of the most difficult decisions that I've made since I've been in office.
North American Rockwell get the gig. What is the aircraft that wins the contract that becomes the B-1?
The airplane's a big airplane. It's 395,000 pounds, but that's not a huge airplane. That's actually a little lighter than the B-1. It's a very streamlined airplane. It's very much a Mach 2 airplane. When its wings are swept back, it looks like it's going Mach 2 on the ground. It's an airplane that can sweep its wings forward for cruise and for takeoff and landing. But even though it can go Mach 2, and a lot of its airframe is shaped around Mach 2, you can see the what's called the area rule in how its fuselage is formed to minimize wave drag, where its sweet spot is not Mach 2. Its sweet spot is going at very low altitude at about Mach 0.9, and it can do that for thousands of miles. That's a real trick because jet engines typically guzzle fuel at that altitude, and so having an airplane that can have a range of a few thousand miles at low altitude is quite a trick. Now, in order to fly at low altitude, it has a terrain-following radar and a very sophisticated integrated navigation system, so it can do that low-altitude flight in any weather, day or night. It has engines and airframe that are optimized for that. Remember, you have a long, thin airplane. It has to be long and thin because you want to minimize wave drag at these high speeds. There are a couple of things that come out of that, one of which is that the airframe is inherently going to flex somewhat because it's long and thin. So you have what's called a structural mode control system, little fins in the front. And what they do is take out bending of the airframe in low altitude flight. That's a very interesting example of feedback control system. The airplane is somewhat inherently unstable, and therefore it has a very sophisticated flight control system to keep the airplane pointed in the right direction. It's a fly-by-wire system, although interestingly not a digital fly-by-wire system like a modern airplane would have. It's an analog fly-by-wire system, but a very sophisticated one. The airplane also has a very interesting fuel management and fuel and center of gravity management system, because when you've got a tremendous amount of fuel strung out over this long fuselage, if you have too much of the fuel forward or aft, you're going to have an airplane that is unbalanced. So you would really need a flight engineer if you didn't have this computerized system that keeps the fuel in the right place. An awful lot of requirements and systems capabilities come out of this need to fly low and fast in order to penetrate Soviet air defenses. Part one of that is its ability to fly low and fast. Part two of that is that the airplane is going to be equipped with the world's most sophisticated electronic countermeasure system. That comes out of a company called AIL on Long Island. So the airplane had an ejection capsule. Normally, the means of egress in a high-performance combat aircraft is an ejection seat. So each crew member sits in an ejection seat, and if things go south, they eject out. The F-111 sets a lot of precedent for the B-1. It's not that it's a direct predecessor, but certainly they both were used by the same military service, and the concepts for one bled into the other. The F-111 had an ejection capsule. There's a lot of attractions to an ejection capsule. So in other words, the whole cockpit blasts off instead of individuals being in seats. One of the advantages is that if you're flying at supersonic speeds, above about 400 knots, if you eject, you have a very good chance of being injured or killed. And so when you eject the whole cockpit, the people who are being ejected don't all of a sudden have their bodies subjected to very high-speed airflow, which can injure or kill them. So that's the first and obvious advantage of an ejection capsule. But there's several other advantages. If you're going to eject over the water, and after you eject, you're one person splashing around in the water with your life vest, it's going to be very hard to find you. If you eject in a capsule, you have a ready-made life raft It's going to be, not only are you more likely that, you actually are going to be in this raft, although probably not very seaworthy. I would suspect that that would be a very uncomfortable ride, but nonetheless, you're more likely to be found. There's an additional advantage too. Although the basic crew of a B-1 is 4, it was designed to carry up to 6 people. Now you have 4 crew members in the B-1. You have a pilot in the front left and a co-pilot in the front right. In the back, you have what's called an OSO, or offensive systems operator. That's a navigator who is focused on navigation and weapons delivery. And then you have what's called a DSO, or defensive systems operator. That's the person who's operating the electronic countermeasure system. In the U.S. Air Force, that person would be a rated navigator. So it's not a flight engineer, it's a defensive systems operator. So you could have an instructor pilot who would sit on a jump seat between the pilots, and then an instructor systems operator in the back who would sit between the offensive systems operator and the defensive systems operator. Those people normally wouldn't have ejection seats. In a B-52, those people don't have ejection seats. So if you have an airplane without ejection seats, then you have some crew members who have a lesser probability of surviving an ejection, because they have to manually bail out with parachutes. With an ejection capsule, you don't have that problem anymore. So an ejection capsule seemed like a really cool feature to put on the B-1. And in fact, you'll see it on the first 3 B-1A prototypes. Nonetheless, it got dropped. In fact, it got dropped even, and we're getting ahead of ourselves with the story, but the production B-1, had it gone into service, would have reverted, if you will, to ejection seats. It would not have had an ejection capsule. Ejection capsule had a bunch of problems. The first thing, it's essentially another aircraft. So now you have to design an aircraft that fits on another aircraft. So it's a very expensive, complex thing. Furthermore, the sequence by which a ejection capsule severs all the connections to the airplane, rockets away from the airplane, and then all these parachutes and airbags and things come out. There's something like 1,000 things that have to happen for this ejection to happen. So from a reliability point of view, an awful lot of things have to work right. And in one case where it was used on one of the prototype B-1s, a crew member was killed because everything did not work quite right.
The more things in the chain, the more chances that one of those things can go wrong, causing a cascade.
Exactly. And in most cases, you don't have redundancy. So any single point failure will have catastrophic consequences. If you have a very complicated device and everything has to work just perfectly, you probably have to have a lot of maintenance. So this ejection capsule was going to drive maintenance requirements, and it got worse than that. The ejection capsule is not a little thing. It's really the cockpit of the aircraft. It's an integral part of the structure. So in order to remove the ejection capsule to periodically maintain it, you can't just lift it out of the airplane. The airplane would fold up on itself. It would collapse. So you have to support the whole airplane. Every time you wanted to maintain it, or at least undergo a major overhaul, it was a major engineering project. But the B-1 was optimized for low altitude flight. And at low altitude flight, you have a larger safe ejection envelope with ejection seats and with this ejection capsule. So it was an interesting idea, but it would not have been in the production aircraft and was not in the B-1B that was eventually fielded.
The Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona is home to one of the largest non-government funded aviation and space museums in the world. Featuring nearly 400 aircraft, the museum is home to an incredible collection like NASA's NB-52 X-15 dropship and 747 SP Sophia Airborne Observatory, to a wealth of rare military types from air forces all around the world, to the first production 777 and the second prototype 787 Dreamliner. Whether you're a military or civilian aviation geek, there will be an incredible aircraft around every corner of this epic 80-acre site for you to explore. As the Aviation Show's partnership with the Pima Air and Space Museum enters its 3rd year, we're delighted to say that Pima is truly a top of your bucket list museum to visit. And it keeps getting better because the Philippine Mars is now on display, and right across the car park, the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum's doors are wide open to welcome you in to check out an amazing collection of tanks, armored fighting vehicles, and other vehicles, if you get fed up with all the airplanes. To find out more about the incredible collection and the fantastic events coming up at the Pima Air and Space Museum, and of course the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum, head over to www.pimaair.org to plan your trip to one of the world's great aviation collections, and one that now includes tanks next door, if that's your sort of thing.
For the B-1, we have 4 aircraft that are built. What are the initial findings of the aircraft? What are the crews reporting back?
The full-scale development started in 1970. The first B-1A flew in 1974 at the end of the year. It was followed later by B-1A number 2 and B-1A number 3. It was a good airplane. I mean, any new airplane is going to have problems, but the B-1 did not have a lot of major problems. It flew well. It was clearly going to be an effective airplane. It was a good airplane because it was advanced and ambitious, but not too advanced and too ambitious, unlike the B-70, which was simply far too ambitious and paid the price. The B-1 was a well-balanced airplane. It balanced off reliability, maintainability, avionics capability, performance. It wasn't the ultimate in any one regard, but across the range of capabilities, it was quite good. It also was an airplane that I think benefited from advances particularly in electronics technology. One of the things that sunk the B-58 Hustler, for example, was that the airplane had tremendously advanced electronics, but they were all analog electronics, and it was just ahead of its time. It was very unreliable. By the time that B-1 came around in the early 1970s, digital electronics had advanced greatly. And so you had a true digital airplane, and that paid off enormous benefits in terms of operational capability and reliability.
So we have a very good aircraft, one that's going through its test program well. And again, we have to come back to politics because it's arriving at a very difficult time. But what else is happening that is making a bomber seem unpalatable?
The B-1 suffered from bad timing. You're talking about an airplane that's under development in the early 1970s. Now, let's put this in context. These are the ending years of America's involvement in the Vietnam War. Purely from a domestic political point of view, was a highly destructive and divisive conflict. When we were coming out of this war in the early mid-1970s, in general, there was not much support for the military. There was a belief that the pursuit of the Cold War had gotten us into this messy and unnecessary and divisive war. And there was also belief that perhaps we could reach an arrangement with the Soviet Union, and that whereas previously we had been focusing on deterrence through a very strong military and confrontation. Again, that's the kind of thing that got us into the Vietnam War. That now we ought to try a new policy of detente, of signing arms control treaties. And if you're in this political environment, the most high visibility military expenditure was the B-1. I mean, the B-1 sort of symbolized a traditional confrontational approach towards the Soviet Union. And so it became a very controversial weapon system as a result. As opponents of the B-1 would say, do we need additional nuclear overkill? We can already destroy the Soviet Union. Why do we need to do it even more? The B-1 may have intrinsically been a very capable weapon system, but there was a broader political question. Do we need this capable weapon system at all?
As we evaluate the B-1 proposal, we must ask, how much is enough? With all that this country has now for defense, do we really need to spend $750 million next year for another bomber? With the economy the way it is, spending all that money on the B-1 would be like spending money you don't have on a house you don't really need. A great many arguments are advanced by the Air Force for the B-1 bomber program. They say the B-1 would be useful in conventional warfare, like the B-52 was over North Vietnam. But even if that situation did arise again, it makes no sense to send $85 million bombers over which could be shot down by a $50,000 missile.
There was another problem that the B-1 had, which is that an alternative had come up out of left field. cruise missiles had been around for a long time. Of course, the most famous of those was the German V-1 in World War II. The United States had fielded various cruise missiles in the Cold War in the 1950s and 1960s. They weren't particularly effective weapon systems. The jet engines were inefficient. The electronics weren't very good. The nuclear weapons were rather large. And so as a result, they weren't very effective weapon systems. But a new generation of cruise missiles had arrived. They had much more efficient one-use turbofan jet engines. They had much smaller miniaturized nuclear warheads. And just as on the B-1, you finally had highly reliable and accurate electronic navigation systems. So you could build a small yet highly effective long-range nuclear-armed cruise missile. And people started to ask the question, if I can build a bunch of cruise missiles and I can put them on my B-52, and so instead of having to shoot down one bomber, you have to shoot down, let's say, a dozen cruise missiles, and the bomber itself doesn't have to penetrate enemy air defenses. Why do I need to build a B-1 at all? This is an alternative that, let's say, would cost half as much and might be just as effective. Now, remember that the B-1 or any bomber is part of a triad.
American strategic forces are built around the triad: manned bombers, land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, and sea-launched ballistic missiles.
It's not all of America's strategic deterrence. It's one leg of three, and to some extent, a bomber is a redundant backup to the other legs. So it isn't even a question of, is the B-1 as effective as a B-52 that's been retrofitted to carry cruise missiles? Is it good enough at half the cost? And so in 1977, President Carter, who had run against the B-1, had to make a decision as to whether we were going to go ahead with the B-1 or not.
One of the first decisions that I'll have to make as president will be whether or not to proceed with the B-1 bomber.
And he weighed the pros and cons, and he decided that he was going to have a program that consisted of rearming the B-52 with cruise missiles, and that the B-1 was going to be canceled as a production program. Like the United States, presidents don't unilaterally do these things. He advocates a policy, and then, of course, it has to go through Congress. Now, as a result, he did prevail, and the B-1 production was canceled. And instead, there was a new program to arm the B-52 with cruise missiles. But this wasn't the end of the B-1. First of all, testing of the B-1 continued at a reduced level. The official reason was that this was to maintain options for the future. If you're somewhat cynical about politics, I think that this was also a bone to throw to the B-1 proponents so that they would have something. It kept some people employed. It kept the airplane an option for the future. And so you could buy some votes from people who might have liked the B-1, but didn't particularly want to defy the President of the United States. The second thing is that there had been 3 B-1As under contract. They were going to be the pre-production aircraft. And 2 of those were canceled, but B-1A number 4 would be continued. That would be the first airplane that would have the elaborate electronic countermeasure system. So it would add much to the testing. The third thing is that parts of the B-1 survived. The B-1 offensive avionics system was being produced by Boeing. Even though Boeing didn't get the prime contract for the airplane, they did get the avionics system contract. And a derivative of that system would be refitted to the B-52, where it would be needed to target and align and launch the cruise missiles. So in various ways, the B-1 survived its cancellation. The B-1 was regarded by Republicans as an example of Carter's weakness. In 1981, the president gave a speech when he laid out his program for rearming America, and so the B-1 was back in business.